What's up, gang? It's Mark with another riveting edition of the Pearl Snap Tactical Podcast, the show that gives you the tips and tools you need to make yourself stronger, faster, and harder to kill. We are soldiering away at part 2 of the Civil War has been canceled until further notice. This is part 2. In the first installment of the series, I made an argument that ran contrary to what a lot of pundits and talking heads have been propounding on the airwaves and interwebs as of late. And that is that the Civil War, or my position is that the Civil War is not coming to a town near you, at least not anytime soon. Now, having said that, it's not because the tensions in the country aren't real. It's not because our nation's institutions are healthy, and it's certainly not because the elites are unified or benevolent to us. The reason why I do not believe the Civil War that everyone keeps predicting hasn't happened yet is because it's been structurally prevented through a process of managed decline. And I'll talk about that a little later. So before I do that, let's, as a quick recap, top off what we talked about in part 1. I've put the link in the show notes if you want to go listen to that one and get spun up on it. But basically, I explained that modern systems, particularly the ones in the West, right, in which we find ourselves in, do not suppress unrest by brute force, large scale, because it's not in their interest to. It's much better to prevent it from cohering in the first place. So through surveillance, administrative power, economic leverage, and narrative management, that does a lot better job than tanks out on the street and with less risk to boot. So in effect, the government elites or the governing elites, let me get my words right, they compete within the system rather than by destroying it, or I should say replacing it, right? Because total collapse would threaten everybody on the top. So instead of a revolution, what we get is managed decline. So let's talk about that right quick. So when I say managed decline, I'm talking about a prolonged period in which institutions weaken, corruption increases, public trust erodes, but the system itself remains intact. It may be hemorrhaging and it may be compromised, but it doesn't collapse. So instead, elites compete within this existing structure while shifting the costs and the risks downwards using financial, regulatory, and digital leverage to contain the unrest and preserve their position. So instead of it's basically decay without rupture. So instead of an explosion, you get just a slow constriction. And once you accept that terrain, right, the question changes. Well, if we don't have a cinematic rupture that's going to reset the board, and there's no moment in history that's going to happen to act as a rallying point for groups to form, coordinate, and take meaningful, decisive action, then the real question, I think, becomes this, is how does an individual live well, remain free, and preserve their dignity inside a system that is decaying but not collapsing? And that, my friends, is where this series is ultimately headed. But first, we do need to survey the landscape and really look from the inside out what managed decline looks like, so we can kind of get a read of the terrain. And that's what we're going to cover in this episode. So before we do that, quick shout out to my subscribers, my premium subscribers on Substack. I really appreciate you guys supporting the show. If you want to support the show and get members exclusive only content and access to the team room where we meet quarterly online, face-to-face, where we do deep dives into this and interact. You ask me questions, I talk to you, and we see each other, right? That kind of stuff. Go ahead and upgrade your free subscription. It's just a couple bucks a month, but it makes a world of difference in supporting this show and helping us go forward. So without further ado, we're doing The Civil War Has Been Canceled, Part 2, Living Inside of Managed Decline. It's all on the Pearl Snap Tactical Podcast, and we're starting right now. All right, let's get into it. We are back with the Pearl Snap Tactical Podcast, still recorded live from an undisclosed location south of the Mason-Dixon line. All right, before we get into talking about managed decline, I do want to do a couple cleanup from episode 1 as well, just from fielding questions and comments that I got back after I uploaded the first episode, and this whole idea about why people keep expecting the Civil War, and it really has to do with a paradigm or a worldview, I guess, to say, from both the right and the left. So before we talk about the strategy, let's clear away this psychological obstacle that I think is just getting people stuck in this paradigm. And that is, people keep expecting a civil war because each side is projecting, in my opinion, an outdated model of the conflict. So let's take the left. We'll do the left and the right. So on the modern left, power is assumed to flow through mass or from mass mobilization. So that's why you get the protests, the narrative dominance, institutional capture, right? The street pressure. Those are things that, if you're operating from a left paradigm, to you seems to be those are the decisive things that we want to be involved with. And that's why the left often appears a lot more organized and ideologically aligned. So, and that certainly has worked for them in the past, and though that's definitely, they play to their strengths, right? But what they mistake for momentum is often permission. So what I mean by that is that their movements are legible, right? They're seen, they're exposed, they are monitored, and they are bounded. They have limits to which they can operate, right? And they're tolerated by the elites precisely because they can be managed. So they provoke, they're useful to the elites, and they provoke reaction, but they don't really achieve any real transfer of power, right? They can cause chaos, they can cause disruption, but as far as forming nationwide change, it just never materializes, right? Now, let's look at the right. So the right is operating along a different paradigm. All right, it's very different. So power is assumed to flow from physical competence, meaning arms, weapons, the moral legitimacy, and a readiness for a kinetic or a physical showdown, so that when things, quote unquote, kick off, these traits are believed to be the ones that are going to matter most. And all you got to do is do a quick search online. You can Google it, and you can find stories from, things that are more right-leaning media channels that will say, oh, who would win in a civil war? And you'll see these maps, or in the event of a civil war, who has the most firepower, and you'll see the southern states or red states and things like that. And someone will do some kind of analysis of how quick this would be over because all the 2A people are armed and everything like that, right? But capability without organization is a liability when you live under surveillance state, right? There is no elite sponsorship. There is no administrative tolerance. There's no coordinating structure, right, that the right has if they wanted to go kinetic that could survive any type of scrutiny using the parameters that we talked about in the first episode, right? So what is the result? The result is you've got plenty of competence, right? You have plenty of ability, but there's no leverage. It's not going to be leveraged anywhere. And so again, you just got a bunch of people posting things on X or Twitter, waiting for someone to come and rally the troops, and that day is never going to come. So in effect, if I wanted to just sum it up, I'd say the left is living in Russia 1917 with the October Revolution, and the right keeps imagining America in 1776. Neither one is living in 2026. Right. So as long as each side remains in their paradigm, right, the system doesn't need to defeat either side. All it's got to do is just contain one, fragment the other, and then you start extracting or burning out, from both ends. You extract from both, right? And that's what leads to the trap, is that people are waiting for a rupture that never comes. And they outsource their agency and really a lot of their life force and energy into a quote unquote the moment, right? They burn out their emotional energy on the latest sensational headlines, or participating in some small scale riot or protest, or galvanizing, voter turnout at the ballot box, hoping to ignite some mass movement that never comes. But what does come, the result is containment, right? Mike Shelby, he didn't word it this way. I don't really know Mike Shelby personally from Forward Observer. I've followed him for years. He's been a guest on the show, and we've exchanged emails, and that's about, I would call him an acquaintance, but super good dude, super knowledgeable. And a few weeks ago, and really in other episodes that he's done on Forward Observer, he'll oftentimes sketch out a template, for instance, for how like the Trump administration could burn out some of the left's energy in Minnesota or elsewhere using the Insurrection Act. So he kind of laid out a template that, by doing that before the midterms, by the time the main scale elections, came due, the left's energy could kind of been burnt out. So that remains to be seen whether or not they do that. But he's talked about other ways you could, without using the wording I just did, but just kind of described how the system could just burn out a movement, right? Just by simple containment, right? But anyway, that's kind of how I see that it's happening, really. And in the meanwhile, the system continues to discipline the people. And I talked about what disciplining the populace means in episode 1, so I'm not going to keep rehashing that. But I'll just leave it at this before I move on to manage decline. I'll leave it at this, and that is, in the first installment of the series, I did list out. I'm not saying civil war can't happen or that it won't happen. In fact, I did list out some indicators which, if they did occur, it would change my opinion on whether or not a civil war would occur here. So I'm not going to rehash that either, but you can go back and listen to that episode for the list. But suffice it to say, currently, I don't see any of those indicators shaping up at present. And if it does, I would definitely reevaluate my position and brief you on my findings if that should occur. So let's jump into now. I keep using this phrase, managed decline, so let's talk about it. Now that I've shared with you my definition for managed decline, which is up in that we talked about in the intro, it's time to see or examine what it looks like and what it feels like. So first off, managed decline doesn't look or feel like chaos. Historically, when we've seen it, it looks like rising obligations, shrinking protection from the institutions, increasing complexity, and declining trust. And that list is pretty self-explanatory, except for the rising obligation part. So let's talk about that for a minute. So during managed decline, obligations rise even as institutional performance fails. So the system becomes less competent, right? Just go down to your local DMV, right? I'm struggling right now just as an aside to get my vehicle tags renewed, and it's just been an absolute nightmare, right? But the system becomes less competent, it's less trusted, and it's really less responsive. But it does not reduce its demands on you. And instead, it compensates by just shifting the risk and responsibility downward onto you and me. So we can see this historically in the later years of the Roman Empire. So as tax, and just if you're not a super history geek, right, usually when you're talking about Roman Empire, you're talking about I suppose 3 stages, right? You have the Roman Republic, which is before Caesar, then Empire, and then Empire splits between the West and the East, and the West kind of declines and corrodes, and then you have the Eastern down in Byzantium, which goes on for another millennia, right? I don't want to get that deep in the weeds, but we're talking about in the later years of the Roman Empire, when the West and East were still unified, as the tax revenues fell and the military pressures increased, the state didn't shrink, right? In fact, the bureaucracy grew, all the while tightening control on the populace. So tax burdens became harsher and more rigid. Farmers were legally bound to their land in order to prevent flight, right? So you might not have known that, but we go back to the Middle Ages and we look at the serf, in the feudal Europe, and we're like, oh, serfs are bound to the land, and we just kind of assume that that was always the case, and no, that was not always the case. And so what the empire did is oh, you're a farmer, you're farming this, we're going to tax your produce or whatever you get from the land. Oh yeah, and by the way, you can never leave it. You got to work there till you die. Right. So we can try to keep the economy stable that way. Trades became hereditary, right, in order to stabilize revenue streams. Right. We don't want people bouncing around. We want to keep them. We want some stability in there too. And so the empire is weakening. Right. This is why they're taking these drastic measures. And so they are weakening, but they are increasing their obligations. So that's what I mean by when I say rising obligations. That's what occurs during managed decline, right? You also see something similar in Soviet life during the days of the Soviet Union. So economic performance stagnates, shortages became normal, yet the paperwork, the surveillance, and the party oversight expands. So the state's legitimacy in the eyes of the people declined, but its administrative reach did not. So in modern context, the pattern is far more subtle but familiar. So in the day and age we're living right now, economic obligations rise through inflation that's eroding everybody's savings while wages lag behind. So then debt becomes structural. So what I mean by that is like mortgage, student loans, consumer credit, things that tie people to employment systems that they distrust, but they can never exit. And so licensing and credential inflation means that more professions require more formal gatekeeping, which increases compliance and dependency. So there's a lot of stuff now that you got to have, you got to get permits for, you got to get licensing for, you got to do things that 100 years ago you didn't have to, right? So it's just that government creep that goes in there, right? And so the administrative burdens increase as regulatory complexity expands, right? So even in business, right, small operators spend more time navigating compliance, right, than growing their enterprises. The larger institutions can absorb those costs, like your Fortune 500 companies, but the individuals can't. And so selective enforcement kind of creates this uncertainty. Not everybody's punished, but everybody knows that they could be. And so it just creates more of that entanglement into the system. And so digitally, financial transactions are increasingly traceable. Platforms can moderate or deplatform people at scale, right? And we've definitely seen that with the gun industry, right? Fighting that battle within certain banks won't run their transactions and things like that, right? Reputation is persistent and searchable. Things that you post today, next thing you know, you try and go for a job interview 5 years from now, you may not even be that same person you were 5 years from now, but that thing's out there on the interweb and it's searchable and someone can pull that up, right? And none of this, absolutely none of this requires any type of overt or authoritarianism from the system. It just raises the cost to you of stepping outside what are the acceptable boundaries. So social reputational systems, right, replace coercion. Social ostracism, right, professional blacklisting, credential revocation, right? These are powerful deterrents. And the individual has to calculate that risk constantly, not because they love the system, but because your exposure to it is total, right? And so the effect is not dramatic repression. It's constraint, right? It's just an ever tightening constriction, right? That just kind of chokes you out. And so rising obligations create dependency, and dependency produces the caution, right? Caution. People willing to take risk and step outside the lines. People to form groups or participate in groups, right? That are revolutionary in nature. So caution suppresses mobilization. So people aren't pacified because they're content. they're pacified because they're entangled within the system. They have a lot to lose, right? Now, of course, there are exceptions. There are people who are out there on the street demonstrating, burning down the city, during summer love and stuff like that. They don't care about that. But I'm just talking about that enough of the people that it would take to form a true revolt, right? You don't have that, right? So financial leverage, regulatory exposure, digital traceability, vulnerability to reputation makes taking exponentially more costly than it was in prior eras, right? So the energy that might have gone toward a rebellion is instead consumed by compliance, like paying your bills, maintaining your credentials, protecting your assets, just managing your exposure, right? And this is how a system in decline disciplines without tanks in the street, right? Not by inspiring loyalty, but just increasing the friction until survival itself requires you to cooperate with it. And that's why the unrest simmers. It's always there, right? You can feel it. You can see it on any platform you go onto, on any conversation you have with your friends or down at the coffee shop, right? It's always there, right? But it never ignites. And we've seen this before. So in the late Roman Empire, right, elites hollowed out institutions while exempting themselves from the burden. So office holding, right, on the lower rungs became financially ruinous, right? Taxation intensifies, but the protection offered by the institution weakens. So the empire didn't fall overnight, but it did just withdraw from large portions of life. And so who were the folks that survived? Well, it wasn't the senatorial class that were just clinging to their titles, right? It wasn't the urban dependents in the cities that were tied to the grain doles. The survivals were the provincial landowners, the craftsmen, the merchants, the clerical communities. Oh, yes, because this part of this was going on. All that stuff I said about rising taxes, being tied to the land, being forced into the job and occupation that your father had, all that was after the Christian conversion as well, right? So these were groups of people who were able to reduce their exposure to the system while maintaining their usefulness. So before I go any farther, I can already hear an objection. I totally get it, but the objection would, someone might say, well, look, if the system just continues to tighten and control people and funnel them into poverty, isn't that exactly the conditions that give rise to civil war? Well, yeah, but it can, but with a caveat. So what we're dealing with in this current stage in America is fundamentally different than what our ancestors experienced in previous eras. So let's look at that. So civil wars require surplus energy. And what I mean by that, they require people who are economically mobile, socially bonded, and structurally independent enough to absorb the risk, right? They require large numbers of individuals who can coordinate finance and sustain prolonged disruption. Managed decline removes all that surplus energy. So when people are financially leveraged, right, credentially dependent, digitally traceable, concerned, or reputationally exposed, they can't afford sustained defiance. They might be angry, they might be cynical, but they are also constrained. And that's the big difference. So instead of mobilization, you just get exhaustion. So instead of civil war, you get a population that just adapts to tightening conditions while institutions hollow out from above, right? It's just like the frog and the boiling pot of water analogy. They just adjust, we just continue to adjust to it. And that's the difference between a revolutionary breakdown and managed decline. One explodes and the other just continues to restrict, right? So why is a peasant's revolt a non-starter? So I mentioned earlier that civil war requires of many things, but one being folks that are economically mobile. So let me clarify that, because I can already hear someone say, well, civil wars have often been fought by peasants, right? Or some of the foot soldiers drawn by the peasantry, right? Those people weren't economically mobile. They were poor. And that's true. They were poor. But poverty in the pre-industrial society is structurally different from poverty inside a modern integrated system. So a medieval peasant might have been land bound and material limited, but his economic life was local and relatively simple. He wasn't carrying layered consumer debt tied to a national financial institutions. He didn't require state issued credentials to farm, build, or trade locally. His subsistence was often land based and embedded in kinship networks. So if he rebelled, yes, he risked violence, but he wasn't risking instant financial suffocation through centralized banking, digital traceability, or regulatory lockout. So modern poverty looks very different. So today, even the working and middle classes are deeply integrated into a national and global systems or financial. So let me go back. Let me do that one again. So the working classes are deeply integrated into these national and global systems. So income flows through centralized payroll systems. Savings sit, your savings sits in some type of regulated, for most people, regulated financial institution. Employment depends on licensing, credentials, background checks, professional compliance, healthcare, insurance, housing, and the credits are layered and interdependent. So, and supply chains are centralized and just in time, right? We know back in the old days of that disease that was floating around that put the country on lockdown. Like that's when people firsthand got introduced to the fragility of supply chains. Right before that, we didn't really think about how a disruption, within a day or two, and we've got empty grocery shelves. A lot of people weren't tracking that. So the integration creates the fragility. So missing a paycheck today doesn't just mean hardship. It can trigger cascading consequences like to your mortgage default, a credit collapse, a loss of professional standing, lapses in insurance, right? The margin for sustained disruption is very thin. So when I say civil wars require economic mobility, I'm not talking about rich people. I'm not talking about wealth. I'm talking about structural maneuverability, an ability to move within or sidestep the system altogether, the ability to detach from the system long enough to sustain organized resistance. Right? Pre-industrial peasants were poor, but they were less financially entangled. Right? Modern citizens are wealthy across the board on paper, right, than even some of the nobility of the Middle Ages, but they are far more system dependent, and it's that dependency that suppresses mobilization. So it's not because people are satisfied, but because the cost of a prolonged disruption is exponentially higher than it was in prior eras, right? So that is what managed decline looks like, and that's where I think we're living right now, and where we're headed further still. How deep that goes, I have no idea, but I think that's a much more realistic forecast for where we're at and what we're headed for than something else, right? Now, if you followed me this far, I'm certainly not the type of person that likes to black pill or grift off of people's fears or anything like that, right? So if you followed me this far, you might be thinking, then what does life, or what does, being strong or strength even look like in an environment like that? And that's the right question. That's a good question. So listen to me. The days of heroism have not departed us, right? Heroism doesn't disappear just because the battlefield changes, or because the battlefield, as we knew it in prior eras, vanishes even. But heroism is not reckless defiance, and it's not theatrical rage either. It's not burning down a village just because you're angry at the king, right? It's not reckless defiance. So if we go back in the past and look at even the stories of our ancestors, right? If you look at the Odyssey, Odysseus was a warrior in the same class of Achilles, right? He was lethal, right? He fought in the Trojan War. He stacked bodies just like all the others, right? He was renowned for his warriorship on the battlefield. But he survived in the Odyssey, in that tale. He survives his greatest challenges of his life, not through kinetic force of arms, but through his restraint, through his discretion, through his wits and cunning. And diasporas have endured, right, in similar situations by thinking in centuries and not days or weeks, right? Monastic communities preserved civilization by kind of stepping sideways and not charging forward. So when the battlefield disappears, heroism becomes more about endurance, and more about that in the next installment. All right, so let's wrap this up. So decline does not announce itself with a single moment. It reveals itself, in the one who's standing 20 years later. So the goal is not to win history. It is to outlast bad systems while preparing the next generation to build new ones that will replace the old. So in this final installment, we're going to go a little deeper into what individual strategy looks like your skills, your posture, your habits for living well inside of managed decline, right? I've talked about this at length. I've solo episodes. I've had people like John Michael Greer on, where we've talked about civilization decline. You've heard me talk ad nauseum about cycles, right? Cycles of life, that it's a law of nature, right? You are born, you begin to learn through infancy, you gain the strength, the zenith of your strength, and then you begin to age into old age, and you decay, and finally you die. And it's the same for societies, it's the same for governments. Like, you give it a long enough timeline, and you will find that it completes that cycle. So even within that, so the good news is it's completely natural, and it's not something to fear, and it's really not even something to lament, right? But even within that cycle, there are still many golden ages. History is replete with societies and civilizations that were in decline, that experienced small renaissance, right? Moments of beauty, moments of heroism, of awesome stuff, right? And it could be the same for us. The thing is when you find yourself in these cycles, you don't always know what stage you're in. I mean, we know, like, 30,000-foot view, we know our country is not what it was at its infancy, and not what it was at the zenith of its strength, right? But we don't know exactly where we are in that cycle, if we're going to get a rebirth or a little bump, a little mini golden age, or anything like that. All right, so that's what I want to talk about in the next episode, is what does that look like, about how to thrive and flourish even while you're in a state of even while your society is in a state of managed decline. So that's what we're going to do in the final episode. We're going to shift away from just analysis to action, right? And I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not claiming to predict the future, but I can look at history and the individuals and small communities who endured and outlasted institutional decay, economic pressure, and tightening control, and see what they did. And hey, yeah, some of their tactics may not be applicable to us today, but some of them might. The principles might, and we can look at those and discuss those and create a plan of action. So I want to identify those patterns that allow them not just to survive, but to really be functional and resilient, and even quietly prosperous. And from there, we're going to sketch a practical framework based on those examples, right? So that we can have a plan of action that's not based on fantasy, but strategy. So until then, hit me with your questions, DM me, email me, whatever you want to do. Hit me with your questions or comments. Share it with a friend. Tell your buddies about it. But more than anything, until next time, stay sharp and keep it pearl snapped.